Welcome to this Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment webinar on the rise of green crime. I'm hoping that by the end of this, we can be talking about the rise and fall of green crime. Green crime can be defined as illegal activity that threatens biodiversity, damages the environment, impacts supply chains, and poses a danger to global stability and security. Examples of green crime include illegal mining, illegal fishing, illegal wildlife trade, illegal logging, and waste trafficking. This form of crime has always been a prevalent issue, but has gained prominence in recent years. And as a committed environmentalist and writing about things like illegal fishing, I am here with Kay Sidanius, who is the global head of financial crime and industry affairs at Refinitiv. His role there is to identify regulatory changes and lead programs of action with the sole purpose of delivering the best possible outcomes for the planet and the industry. And together with the World Economic Forum and Europol, he formed the global coalition to fight financial crime. Now, prior to Refinitiv, Che worked as a senior advisor to the Bank of England's Financial Stability Directorate and was a senior bank examiner at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. His most notable awards include receiving the Presidential Award for managing the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis and as a driving force behind Refinitiv's Impact Company of the Year Award in 2019. Che received his master's in international affairs from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and his undergraduate degree in political science from UC Berkeley in California. Che will be presenting and then we will be moving after about 20 minutes or so to questions and answers, and fingers on buzzers, folks, because there are in fact two polls during this. Che, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm actually delighted to join you, so thank you very much for the invitation. The introductions on my end has been done so well, so I'm not going to go through sort of my background, but if we can move to the first slide, and I'll do a bit of introduction on Refinitiv as a company, and then to build on the introductions, what we're here to discuss today. So just as a brief background, so Refinitiv is a fairly new company. We were formed about two and a half years ago because of an acquisition, but what we do and the fundamentals of what we do haven't changed since the 1850s. So we're fundamentally a data company, a technology company. And our humble beginnings began when we used carrier pigeons to carry stock prices between Aachen, Germany, and Brussels. And fast forward to today, what we fundamentally do isn't that different, except for the fact that technology has evolved, data has evolved, but we fundamentally consider ourselves as a global data company providing data not only to financial markets, but also to public and private organizations to meet their due diligence requirements, fight supply chain risk, and fight what we call, as a general term, financial crime. So if I could move briefly to the next slide and really highlight some of the key points that I would like to leave you with today. The first is that financial crime and supply chain risk still poses an immense risk to both the businesses, the public sector, and to citizens. I'll make a brief point that this is not just about white-collar crime, but this is about people, about human trafficking, and what we'll talk about today is about green crime, and we'll get into this a bit further. I'll also leave you with, in the end, if we have time, that from my perspective, there is a convergence between the sustainability agenda and environmental crime or financial crime agenda. And I'll talk a little bit about this at the very end. Today's topic, of course, is about green crime. And we'll talk about that this is not just about the importance of this as an ethical investment for the future, but this has reached at the highest level, both to international law enforcement and to policymakers. And then lastly, I'll leave you with what's needed here to tackle this issue is a real change in how we cooperate across the public and private sector, how we use data and information sharing and technology really to break down the barriers and the silos in which many of us operate in, and B, to be able to use each other's strengths and insight to tackle this issue. So if we move to the next slide, and I'll give you a very brief state of where we are when it comes to financial crime. And if we move to the next slide, I'll make it a very quick point that I'm sure we're all aware of, that financial crime continues to dominate the headlines. Not only has it been popularized by shows like McMafia and many other shows on Netflix and Amazon, but what we see in the headlines is that it's continually to be raised as an issue, and more so than just a compliance one, and that it really cuts to the heart of whether or not the integrity of the financial system and the banking system in particular really is at issue here. So I'm sure, as you know, that this has now reached to the G20 level. We were part of a B20 task force on this issue, and we've been also very committed and working with the European Commission in particular in the European context, as they're about to adopt one of the most ambitious anti-money laundering changes that we've seen in recent times. And if we move to the next, I'll remind us that based on a UN study a few years ago now, that out of the billions and trillions, about 2.5 trillion at least, that's being laundered through the global system, that less than 1% of it is actually caught by law enforcement. And this is a figure that really hasn't changed that much. And if we look at the Financial Action Task Force as a measuring stick of where we started and where we are today, the Financial Action Task Force was really started about 31 years ago over the summer, and yet we're achieving a 1% success rate, and that's just not good enough. The second piece, which is that we're seeing that financial crime is growing exponentially. So what you see here on the chart is another UN report that looked at the illicit proceeds in the US alone, illicit proceeds from criminal activity. And the trend is going nowhere but up. And it's truly a global issue that requires a global response. And to the issue of green crime in particular, we started an initiative early last year, which we launched in Davos in January of this year, really to look at the topic of green crime, which we'll talk more specifically in more detail. But what's now put this whole topic on its head is because of COVID-19. If we would have organized the event that we did in Davos a year or 2 years earlier, I doubt that we would have this discussion at the moment. But we know, and it's been reported, that because of wet markets trafficking in China and in many other parts of the world, that this connection between the virus and other pandemic diseases and human activity has put this issue of wildlife trafficking on its head, our impact on the environment on its head. And it's much more about peace and security rather than just sustainable investment. So if we move to the next slide, and if we get into this in detail. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm not going to define what it is. It's been defined already in the opening remarks. But the whole point of green crime is that it expands well beyond any one particular criminal activity, including wildlife trafficking, including supply chains, because they're all interconnected. We know from our data that criminals are they use any types of criminal activity for profit motives. So whether that's transporting wildlife animals, whether that's transporting people, these things are all interconnected, and the criminal organizations are all very interconnected. And the key point here, and what sets this topic apart from our perspective, is this is not, again, about some sustainable point in the future, but it's actually causing real security risks and peace to stability as we know it. If we move to the next slide. Very quickly, I mentioned that this is not about sustainability anymore. And green crime has become one of the fastest growing criminal activities behind transporting of people, of terrorism activity, and it's estimated to be worth about $258 billion. Part of this is also a broader narrative about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in which sustainability is obviously a key part of that. And we're on track to miss 80% of those commitments. The World Economic Forum also reminds us that 50% of global GDP is exposed to the loss of nature. And lastly, this is not, again, just an issue for many of us who are committed to these problems, but this has now reached to the policy initiatives and priorities of Interpol and Europol, who've put together special task forces on this very, very topic. So if I've convinced you that green crime is in fact a problem that we collectively need to pay attention to and take action on, then I would like to commission a poll, if we can, with the team here. And based on those results, we'll also compare the results of that from a previous engagement that we had in the industry. So if I can ask you to please make your vote count. And the question here is, do you agree that green crime is a threat to peace and security? First option is absolutely it is. Second option, well, maybe it is. I need to maybe learn a bit more about it, or not really. So if we give a moment for you to cast your vote, and then we'll see where we land with the results. So that's interesting. So 75% of you said yes, it's absolutely a threat to peace and security. 24% kind of, 1% not really. Now, I'll if we move to the, actually we'll do another poll, and then we'll compare it with the another question that we also posed. The second question, if our organizer can pull that up, thank you. So should green crime receive equal attention as money laundering and terrorism financing crimes? Fairly binary. Yes, it should. No, or not really decided yet. That's also very telling. So 78% said yes, green crime should receive equal attention as money laundering and terrorism financing. 8% said no, 14% undecided. Now, I know in this audience we have securities and investment professionals. We posed similar question to a broader set of stakeholders when we had a webinar on this topic on the 23rd of June. So what I'd like to do now is share those results with you and move to the slide that has the first polling question. So in that response, in which we have about 1,880 registrations for that event, 81% thought, in fact, that green crime is a threat to peace and security. Now, the makeup of that audience was a combination of both policymakers, law enforcement, financial sector professionals, and NGOs. It was a fairly wide range of representation. If we move to the next slide, similarly there, that in fact green crime, it was thought that it should receive equal attention and terrorism financing. And this is the first time that we did that poll back in June 23rd, but it's really fascinating for me really to see that there is a commensurate interest, of course, and awareness on some of these issues. The third poll that we launched as well, which we're not going to do in this webinar, but we said, there is an effort, in fact, to put what's called ecocide alongside other international criminal statutes with the International Criminal Court. And those other international crimes includes genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crimes of aggression. So the question that we asked, should in fact green crime be considered as an international criminal activity akin to other international criminal court issues? And this is what the poll came out with on that particular question. And I did not expect that, but it's clearly a recognition, given where we all are, given the impact of COVID-19 in particular on our life, our families, the economy, and of course, supply chain risk, that there is a incredible recognition that this is a topic that needs further attention to. So did I expect that this question would receive that high of a nod for yes? No, I did not. but it clearly shows that there's a incredible awareness raising that's going on. And part of the webinar today is really to social that awareness, and also to work with many of you who are interested in this topic to know more. And to add to this, if we could move to the next slide. Well before COVID-19 and well before we launched the Green Crime Initiative, we launched a report earlier of this year to look at the impact of third-party relationships. And we interviewed and we surveyed about 1,800 global companies across risk management professionals, compliance professionals. And the results were quite telling because, and I'll only share 3 here. The first is that when we asked them, are you aware or do you suspect that the counterparties that you're dealing with, the relationships that you may have, that they may involve in some kind of illegal, environmentally damaging activities? A shocking 65% said yes. I mean, that is a number that I certainly wouldn't have expected before we launched that report. The second question was also revealing that 61% of them said that even if there's awareness around some of their counterparties or suppliers being involved in some of these activities, that there's no enforcement mechanism. So they're unlikely to be, they are unlikely for any enforcement to be taken against them. But the third point, which is if there is some kind of enforcement, then 93% responded that they actually would enhance their due diligence procedures to supply chain risk procedures. So this points to a very stark fact that companies out there know that this is going on, but they also know that there's no incentive really to deal with it because the enforcement mechanisms aren't commensurate with the risks that they may be facing. If we move to the next slide. So I've tried very briefly here, and I'm very curious to open up for questions and engage. So what are we doing about it? And we think, again, this topic is well beyond each individual organization to tackle on its own, including our own. So we think that we have to really shift the approach and have a much more collaborative action and collaborative response across the public and the private sector, including policymakers, law enforcement, customs officials, tax authorities, and of course the banking community, the corporate sector. And so I'm going to show you a few examples of what we are doing in that regard. So if we move to the next slide. The first thing that we did beyond the Green Crime Initiative, this is something that we launched in 2018. As was mentioned, the early founders were ourselves, the World Economic Forum, and Europol, and have since been joined by a number of other organizations, include the Institute of International Finance, what's not listed here, but the European Banking Federation, and what you will see in the next few weeks is an announcement that Interpol are going to join alongside the European Association of Corporate Treasurers, alongside many other organizations, is that we wanted to form a platform for us to discuss these issues like green crime, but many others, in an effort to inform, educate, and provide specific policy guidance to the policymakers who, so in effect, and at the end of the day, set legislative and regulatory action on these pieces. And some of the key provisions that we've collectively called for is A, there needs to be some legal framework for the public and the private sector to collaborate and share information. That sounds fairly straightforward, but in the context of data privacy, in the context of bank secrecy rules, this is not a straightforward question. The second piece, which is really around ultimate beneficial ownerships and public registries, they need to be more open, they need to be verified, and there needs to be some kind of mechanism for organizations to really use them in a way to actually build on the criminal network piece, which is something that needs to be enforced and reinforced. And there's a number of other very particular policy questions that we've advocated, but this is one effort, certainly from our part, to really find a neutral platform to build trust, find other mechanisms to improve the current regime. Because if we've been at this, and I say we collectively have been at this for 30 years, we're achieving a 1% outcome, yet we keep doing the same thing over and over again, then there's a definition by Albert Einstein that says if you do the same thing over and over again and expect different results, that's the definition of insanity. And the SARS regime is another example, suspicious activity regime, which is not working. We know that. The FIUs, or financial intelligence units, they can't process them. The information that's being sent is not useful. And so we have to look at a much more collaborative framework that calibrates the types of information that's being sent to law enforcement, policymakers, that equates to the actual risk levels that we all face. Now, on green crime and environmental issues in particular, if we move to the next slide. What we've done is that we've partnered with an organization called United for Wildlife, which is really championed by the Duke of Cambridge, really to look at how we collectively can come together, share our expertise, and share our technology and our data. And we have been selected as a preferred data partner in this consortium, really to bring this forward, to make it more effective. We're also working with the Financial Action Task Force. As many of you know, recently published a report on wildlife trafficking in particular. We're also engaged with the German presidency of FATF on this issue, and other policymakers, really to bring this at the top level, including, of course, working with law enforcement globally. And if we move to the next slide, what we're aiming to do, and these are some of the examples of organizations who have joined, and there's 2 task forces as part of this United for Wildlife initiative. The first is the financial task force, which is shown on the next slide, but we'll keep this slide for the moment, which are some of the major banks in the world who are committed to using the risk intelligence in a better way, who are committed to, out of the volume of information and data that they have, to ensure that, they actually can use the best sources and the best intelligence that they have available to them. But the financial part and the money laundering part and the proceeds part is just one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is how do these animals and illegal wildlife, illegal fishing, they're part of a supply chain as well, in terms of shipping companies, airports, airlines, who are part of the mechanism of supplying and shipping, distributing these types of commodities. And so there's a transport task force who we'll be working with. And out of the airlines, for instance, that are part of this task force, it represents about 36% of the total airline industry. And we also have some of the major shipping companies as well. So our part in all this is to bring all this data, all this incredible valuable information that all these organizations sit on, and find a way to help inform both risk assessments, typologies, and also the global nature and which jurisdictions that this activity actually occurs in, and how we can inform organizations and the policymakers to collaborate in a more effective way to prevent some of this activity. I will end it fairly soon. So if we move to the next slide, which I'm not going to, it's basically, these are the organizations on the financial task force. And again, these are some of the largest banks in the world, including money transfer organizations as well. So this is another cut of those organizations. So the last thing I'll leave with, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that many banking communities and institutions, they have their compliance and financial crime department, and they also have their ESG or sustainability department. There's going to be a growing convergence between these two, as it is for us as a company. What does that mean? Our sustainability business, and our ESG business are increasingly taking data from our risk business where I sit, and vice versa. So EDD will be part of the supply chain. Sustainability is very much around, of course, the E, the environmental piece, the S, the social part, where it gets into human trafficking topics. And so there will be, at the policy level, there's already a convergence, but even as a functional level at your company, over time, there will be a convergence between these topics. And then lastly, again, to bring this down to even more from a practical perspective, if we move to the next slide, that for us, this is what that picture looks like. So we have an ESG business, as I mentioned, and we have a financial crime or risk business, as we call it. And the picture here that you see is really an illustration for the types of data, the types of frameworks, the types of approaches and methodology. And there's very much an overlap between how we structure our data, where we source our data, and how we distribute that data, in which our two businesses, like a Venn diagram, increasingly there's an overlap between the two. They will be different because they're used for different purposes. But I just wanted to illustrate this, is that this is impacting how we approach this topic, and that we're increasingly partnering up with each other in order to bring that narrative and that approach in a more effective way between this topic. So I will stop it there, Professor. Thanks for your opening, for your time. I'll just leave this here with you. You will get a copy of this presentation. If you're interested to know more, feel free to click on these links here. Thank you for the invitation, and happy to open up for questions and answers.
Fantastic, Jay, and thank you so much for that. It's a really good opening. We've got about 25 minutes for discussion. I would like to just start with a quick one, if you wouldn't mind. Could you give an example of a real green crime in action and what real financial services institutions did about it?
Absolutely. I'll give you a case. In 2019, there was a whistleblower of an Icelandic fishing company that reported that company that person worked for bribed officials in Namibia of around $10 million to secure access to very lucrative fisheries. And that Icelandic company used intermediaries in Mauritius, Dubai, and Norway to transfer these funds to corrupt officials. Because of some of and this came out in the WikiLeaks, by the way, and when companies started to pull the pieces together, then that network started to unfold. And so that's one example of how companies, the private sector in particular, can really make an incredible contribution in providing transparency on some of these issues, and which is another reason why we're big promoters of public registries as well, because those are the nodes, and you can start making these connections. And I can give you others as well. I mean, there's an example in 2016. There was 3 semi-public companies in Mozambique, that those companies were in fact connected to the intelligence industry, the intelligence service within that country. And those PEPs, or politically exposed persons, were using this consortium in a way to funnel $2.2 billion, which put Mozambique in an indebted situation that it couldn't get out of. International funds and development funds were frozen, and also the Western companies who were part of advising that those 3 companies was put on investigation as well. So this will give you 2 very quick real life examples.
Great. No, just helps sometimes to ground it. Excellent examples. Something like this, though, to the layperson might smack of a huge amount of bureaucracy on the way. And one of the attendees says, if 99% of illegal funds are never caught, despite hundreds of millions of anti-money laundering checks in the UK each year, is there a more efficient way of tracing the proceeds of crime that will inconvenience the criminals far more than it does most innocent members of the population? Excellent
question. And I should have mentioned straight at the beginning is that the purpose of the Global Coalition, the purpose of our engagement with United for Wildlife, is a word that I didn't mention, but it actually sits at the heart of what we're aiming to do, which is about effectiveness. The current system is, well, ineffective beyond whichever word you can use to describe it. And that's a fundamental problem. It's not hundreds of millions, it's billions that's being spent, and yet we're achieving that. So it's not more regulation, it's not more bureaucracy, it's more effective bureaucracy It's more effective ways to share information, more effective ways to recalibrate the priorities and the risks that the law enforcement has with the capabilities and resources that banking sector has. So measures of success will be about effectiveness, not about just more regulation.
Mm-hmm. John Martin asks, given the global scale of the problem and therefore it is difficult to control, monitor, and enforce across international borders, what's your number one priority which starts to address the sizable challenge that is faced? I'm somewhat sickly reminded of the old metaphor of if you want to eat an elephant, you need to chop him into tiny bits, which is not exactly appropriate for this conversation, but I think John's got a really good question here. So, what's the immediate priority? What can you do that can make a difference in the near term?
So I think it's a very practical question. So for us, it's about data. How do we structure data? How do we provide more informative data that can then be used, analyzed, and take action on? And that's where we come in as a company. So there's not a lack of data out there. The question is, what's more important? So very practical example, from our perspective as a company, we use artificial intelligence and machine learning because the volume of unstructured data is exploding exponentially, right? So a lot of the information has come from news reports, all the rest of it. So there's an article, George arrests Chase Sedanius associated with wildlife trafficking. Companies don't want to know about George. They want to know about me, and you want to know about what crime I'm associated with. Now that sounds simple, but that requires intelligence and machine learning to be able to do that rapidly. So we're working on that piece. And then how do we scale that up? And that's part of what we're going to do with United for Wildlife. And then the second piece, which I mentioned from a policy perspective, is how do we get greater clarity on data privacy, which is another immediate task. Now, in the UK, we're incredibly pleased with the UK government because they changed the UK data protection bill for this exact reason. And now we're working with the European Commission and the European Data Protection Board as just another example to provide clarity that we can work on personal data and the entities in a way that doesn't violate any kind of right to be forgotten provision or needing for express consent provision. So those are, from a practical data perspective and from a policy perspective, those are two immediate objectives.
Would you mind just elaborating on what was changed in the bill, what was causing the problem and what was changed? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I don't want to make this into a data protection topic, but it's another webinar that we can do, but be very, very quick. You have two regimes, regulatory regimes that don't speak to each other. And in effect, banks and other organizations would have to choose which regulatory regime to be non-conformant with. On the one hand, they needed to meet data protection rules, which clearly states that if you're going to process personal information, then you need to ask for express consent. And that individual who you have data from, they have the right to say, all that information you have about me, I want to delete it. Now that flies in the face of compliance obligations. If it happens that individual who makes that right to be forgotten request happens to be on a US sanctions list or an EU sanctions list or an Australian sanctions list, then you can imagine the consequences of that. And this is not theoretical, by the way, it's happened. And those are the two. So we're working through that. So what the UK government did is that they provided an exempt provision that if you're doing something to meet international obligations and standards, like the OSCE due diligence requirement, like the UN Global Compact, et cetera, that those global obligations take precedence over the right for individuals who may be associated with some criminal activity to afford themselves of that. So that's the first piece. And so it recognized the global nature, which data protection regulation doesn't. It only recognizes the member state, and it doesn't recognize the global nature of this problem.
Well, it's great to hear of one area where GDPR is not the excuse for not doing something.
Yeah.
So that is absolutely super. You talked about sharing information. In the anti-money laundering space, we've had a lot of difficulty with this. There's ferociously poor feedback. A couple of countries, Italy and Greece, spring to mind, at least collated enormous data sets, which allowed people to train their machine learning algorithms on them. So they would say, well, here's 65 million transactions, 100 of these are dodgy go find them. It's not always just about being pushed with information that I've pre-interpreted. It's actually about having access to raw bodies, repositories. Do you have any plans in that regard?
Well, that's what we do, right? So companies outsource that functionality to companies like us. So in effect, if companies wanted to do this themselves, or banks wanted to do this themselves, they would have to hire 450 researchers covering 65 languages on 190 different jurisdictions, which would be an immense cost burden and reduce the return on equity to probably negative. And so they prefer to outsource this because we specialize on it. We've been doing this for 20 years as far as the financial crime space. They can focus on serving their customers and selling their services and products, and then the data aggregation and collation, distribution, and using technology to do that is at the core of what we do. So that's why companies prefer for someone else to do it.
Yeah, good. I mean, I was heavily involved in the creation of the Marine Stewardship Council, and have done a lot of work with the program for the endorsement of forestry certification, which is far and away the largest of the sustainable forestry tracking systems. You pointed out, at the very beginning, that this is about very much the impact on supply chains as well, which I think to a lot of people wouldn't sound like, how's that a green crime? But it clearly is, as we look at kind of, source to use of all of these areas. How closely are you working with some of these international social and ethical standards bodies that are doing things like provenance and chain of custody for a whole variety of these areas?
Thank you for that. So we're just at the starting tip of this. So our first salvo in this piece is collaborating with United for Wildlife as a consortium. But I know that there is a multitude of organizations out there who've been doing this for a long time, who are not only sitting on incredibly valuable data, but it's how we bring it together in a way where it makes sense. So we're just, to answer your question, we're just at the beginning of doing that. And to make another very practical point, what we're doing as a company and why the United for Wildlife decided to partner with us is because we're not the only, we're by far the largest risk intelligence data provider. And so all the intelligence that we get, as long as it meets our data inclusion criteria, we'll get into our risk intelligence data and then distribute it to the rest of the financial system. So we're a vehicle. So it's not something we charge for. It's if you're a customer, we're just enriching our data set. And so any organization, whether NGOs who do incredible work, other organizations who have, we've been doing this for Liberty Asia and many other, or Liberty Shared as they're called now. So that's what we're looking to do. We're willing to partner with anyone who has information that we can then distribute to the system.
Jay, when I first came across the concept of green crime, I was simultaneously very interested and instantly critical. Very interested because I believe in it, but critical in that previous attempts at criminalization have often backfired. I could think of the drugs trade, for example, where this has not been particularly helpful, but I could also point to sort of the on-running debate in CITES about whether or not trade in animal parts is or isn't good, or should it just simply be criminalized and banned. What are some of the problems with using the word crime, or do you see that as a very positive move?
Great question. And there is a difference to be made here between legal wildlife and illegal wildlife. I guess our point with green crime is that we should rethink that topic in the sense that, look at where we are. Look at the impact that we're having. That we're going through a sixth extinction event at the moment, caused by humans. And I guess our point is, let's have a different think about this, because it's not just about ethics anymore. This is about survival. And I hear many times about, saving the planet. It's not really saving the planet will be fine. It's saving ourselves. And that's why to answer your question, I would need to have a discussion on this, because I think it's a really important point to have a convention on this topic. And it's not just about capital allocation for ethical use anymore. It's not just about the capital side of the world, but it's about corporates, It's about, many parts of our society. We have to think of, do we need to be more critical on this? Because, look at the diseases that are flourishing, and it also fuels environmental devastation, fuels other criminal activity, right? It fuels human trafficking, right? As you devastate, the farmland, then you have a migration pattern. So I think it's a great question, not one that can probably answer, but it deserves a serious question, because I think we need to move the post here about, what we're actually doing to ourselves.
Yeah, and in fact, other illegal activity creates environmental issues. I'm constantly reminded of, I have been director of 2 gold mining firms, and the scale of illegality in the gold trade beggars belief sometimes. But of course, it's the knock-on effects of arsenic, of people clearing lands, of people going in, and the two are intimately related.
Absolutely.
But when we use the word crime, and I'm not trying to poke at you here,
No, go ahead. Push.
Just when we say that, who are the victims? A crime needs a victim, and you said, and I think quite rightly, it's not the planet, although the planet is harmed. At least the planet that we would like to live on is harmed, but the planet will, as you note, continue on with or without us. Who are the victims?
Look at us. Look at what happened with wildlife, the wet market in China, which Chinese have made illegal, by the way, as a function of that. And so, look at our families, look at the impact on our economies, which is going to have other spill-on effects, right? The fiscal stimulus packages are unprecedented. They pale in comparison to when I used to be at the New York Fed during the financial crisis. That was a walk in the park compared to governments propping up through taxpayer funding and trying to save whole swaths of the economy. So we're all impacted by this, and of course, another topic which is also unearthed some real inequities on top of it in terms of access to healthcare, access to and how it's impacted many parts of our society. So it's I know it sounds a bit glib, but look at where we are. We're all impacted by this, which is the point, is that we have to. Yes, you're right. Crime is born out of the member state from a member state perspective in terms of how they define criminal activity. That's absolutely true. But this is not about a member state issue, because this is a global issue, and viruses don't care about member state criminal definitions and all the rest of it. So it's an important discussion, philosophical discussion. But to answer your point very briefly, we're all in this.
We certainly are. Sean Lloyd has an interesting question here. You mentioned COVID-19 in the context of raising awareness to some green crimes, such as the trafficking of wild animals. How do you perceive some of the potential socioeconomic changes arising out of the pandemic hindering or accelerating efforts to improve ways to combat illegal green activities?
It's going to accelerate, and I don't say that as a well, I see it as a personal point of view, but it's already happening. So the European Commission next year is going to put supply chain risk as one of their key policy focus. There's a geopolitical context, all that, of course, but absolutely the awareness of supply chain risk, the awareness of the intersection, as I meant, the convergence between the criminal agenda and the sustainability agenda has never been more pertinent. So there will be legislative action for sure. That's going to be taken up by DG Just. I know the UK government has also put this as a major focus. We'll see in the US, depending on how things pan out, but everything that I'm seeing with the new president-elect is going to put some of these issues at the forefront. So I see the COVID has been an accelerator in a way that I certainly haven't seen. So.
Now, you've been in a kind of a mode, I gather, where you've been gaining momentum, and now you're looking at achieving it. How, when you walk into the boardroom of a financial services firm, how is this received? And I don't just mean positively. Surely it's not, oh, great, obvious, in which case they should have been doing it. But they must have questions. What are the top 2 questions that you get all the time when you go into a financial services boardroom?
Great question. So it's reminiscent of the previous question before. Is okay, we can't boil the ocean. So where do we go from here? So I would characterize the political will is there. The question is, how do we move the needle and move from something practical? So it can be a very concrete thing as in terms of reviewing risk assessments on these issues, and I can bring some very practical examples as far as from a corporate due diligence perspective. Have a look at your risk assessment program on access agreements and looking at forged or export permits, non-transparent payment by governments, the processing side of the world in which you need to look at the manipulation of and the results of premises inspections, failure to conduct due diligence in the first place. So some very practical things from a corporate risk framework. But then there's the other piece, which is how do we use information in a way that's more informative. And I'm reminiscent of a piece of work that we did on human trafficking, which we're going to do in this space, which looked at which jurisdictions do the traffickers operate. And if you happen to be a UK company with a branch in Romania, there is a strong likelihood that the traffickers themselves, not the victims, there's a strong likelihood that there's trafficking going on in your supply chain or in your financial sort of financial doings. So I think there's a very practical piece, but then it's how do we engage with policymakers in a way where we're not just doing more, but we're doing things more effectively. And then in the banking world, which I've also, that this is not just about, again, spending more, doing more, but I think I've made the case that this should translate to capital levels. So banks who take this seriously, who do something about it, they should have their operational risk capital reduced because that affects the return on equity. And same thing so there should be a carrot and a stick. This shouldn't just be about doing more and spending more, but also companies should be recognized when they are doing something right, that there should be benefits to that in terms of the funding levels or return on the capital levels, etc.
It's interesting. You raised in my mind, why have I not seen green crime on a risk register of the many risk registers that I've seen? It's almost like it should be a standard item. But then I was also thinking it probably, or for most people, that might turn up as a reputational risk area. I don't know whether you think that's an appropriate categorization.
So I think, unfortunately, within the financial crime AML space, we've been victims of categorizing things to a way that doesn't actually reflect reality. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking here of, FATF predicate offenses. Right, there's 21, 22 predicate offenses, so we think of them as though they happen in isolation, which they don't. And to your point, and we know that, we see that in our data. So how do we think conceptually differently about how to tackle these issues? And green crime is just one example, and I'm sure there's other things that you could put in there. But there's connection between corruption as a major factor here in terms of allowing this to happen. So that gets to the piece of how can we haven't seen this, because I think we've been prisoners of a paradigm which hasn't changed in 30 years. Mm. And the point here is that we need to change our paradigm, because guess what? The current system's not working, and it's getting worse, not better. And I'm sure there's other themes that one can point to in other ways. But green crime, I think, is a good one, because who doesn't understand the impact that it's had in terms of where we are. So
it's a tougher nut to crack in some odd ways economically than climate change. In the sense of climate change, there is an answer. We had it in 1997 at Kyoto, and you basically put in a price and you trade it. Now we failed to do that so far at any useful scale, although I might hold out some hope there. But that was an easy one. Do you have any thoughts on how you can internalize this externality of green crime into the system?
Yeah. So for us, the difference here between climate change, of course, is an incredible topic, but it seems remote in a way. Versus green crime is about here and now. Right, it's about that's the point that we're making. This is not about some sustainability thing for the future. This is about peace and security right now, about our, how we get our food, how we source our food and other products. And there's also generational point here to be made, which is, the younger generation, they care very much about this. There's 30 trillion estimated that's going to go from one generation to a younger generation. And they will vote for their feet, and they will vote. And so this gets into, why now? Why is it important? And why? What about this topic in particular? As I said, that this is not just about financial crime and money laundering, but supply chain and Interpol and Europol, who've put this at the top of their agenda as well. So how do we take advantage of that momentum and awareness raising to make tangible efforts?
Yeah, it's actually an area where awareness can have greater impact. I mean, being aware of climate change, maybe I do or I don't go to a solar supplier, but I'm not too sure what's going on in the system. And I recall a really good story, which I was tangentially involved in, which was the trade in ivory in China, where this very famous basketball player, Chinese basketball player, came home and said that this just wasn't acceptable. And there was a series of ads, beautiful, brilliant ads, where a young elephant, a mother elephant and her baby are walking off into the sunset. And the Chinese ad basically says, "Mom, hi, I've got my first tooth." And of course, ivory and tooth in Chinese are the same thing. And then the mother is like, "Oh my gosh, now the trouble starts." It's that really conveying it now. That hasn't eliminated the trade by any means, but it did result in a significant, double-digit percentage point drop in the quantity of the trade. So the awareness that you're promoting with your group is really superb.
Yeah, and if I could say just very quickly on that, because that's a really important point. So I'll share with you, and I'll share with the group that we did another video to that point, which is the real connection between COVID-19. So what's happened, of course, is that environmental tourism or ecotourism has completely gone away. So green criminals, environmental criminals, of course, have moved in. So the rate of poaching is just going through the roof. And so this gets into that point. I'm happy to share that video that, these are real world things and consequences that we're all dealing with. And you're right, making that emotional connection on something that we can all relate to, I think is incredibly important.
A last question in the time available. You've got a wide ecosystem of people all interested and excited, and that's great. But you also talked about trying to find ways, for example, to lower regulatory capital requirements, which requires measurement, or trying to find some way of measuring the externalities of this, none of which I have any particular answers for. But what are you doing with regard to standards in this space? How would I know that somebody is truly a gold standard anti-green crime firm?
So I think there's a supply chain question in terms of which companies have a robust program around supply chain risk, and there are a number of others. There are a number of those out there. I don't want to mention them here, but there are definitely those who take it seriously. So that's one piece. The second piece, in terms of what are we doing at the policy level? So I'm actively engaging with the European Commission and the European Central Bank, again from a European perspective, on highlighting to them that the fundamentals are still there. If you look at the capital risk, or CRD4, if you look at the capital framework, within operational risk, 3 out of the 5 categories are related to fraud, fiduciary responsibilities, in which you can put this issue right in there. And so the framework is there. It's just making sure that the regulators and the supervisors take it into their consideration, because if they have some say here. So we're not starting from scratch. And the first time, by the way, I should say, the first time with the EU AML action plan that the European supervisors has linked the capital requirements directive with the anti-money laundering rules. That is the first time that's ever happened. So they are already recognizing that there needs to be a calibration between the two, which recognizes the fact that a bank who's in trouble because of anti-money laundering reasons can cause systemic risk, and therefore there should be a calibration of capital levels up or down, depending on the actions that you take. So we're doing it at the moment, and I'm hopeful on that part.
Jay, the thanks and congratulations are already coming in, which is a sad reminder that we're coming close to the end of our hour. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points, if I may. One is just to note that the audience is virtually 100% stayed here. So that's an immense sign of interest. And I assume, like me, we would all like to help and do something. Could you name, no, not name, could you please give us just one example of a firm that you've walked into who's done some really meaty change as an example to get us thinking?
So, so I have to give credit here. I know it's a bit of a cop-out, but I have to give credit here to Duke of Cambridge, who started United for Wildlife. So it's not just one firm; it's a consortium of firms. And I would say that a lot of the firms, not all of them, but a lot of them are really putting the money where their mouth is. And so we're committed to work again with the transport sector and the financial task force. Really to make some concrete changes. So if we have this webinar in a year from now or a year and a half from now, I will be able to tell you this is what we did. These are the investigations that we helped. These are the types of green crime, wildlife trafficking cases that we help law enforcement to engage with, and also to support greater awareness raising through, letting people know where some of these criminal activities happen. So I'm incredibly encouraged by many organizations. Standard Chartered is a big believer in this, and thankful for them for bringing us in. But it's not just Standard Chartered, there's many other banks, and also the John Goodson from the International Air Transport Association, who's the godfather of the Transport Task Force, who's a big believer in this, because he sees it as a existential issue for the airline sector. Because, by the way, 50% of all wildlife trafficking goes through hand baggage. 5 tons of bushmeat goes through Charles de Gaulle Airport every week. So they see all this information, but what do they do with it? They don't have any. Who do you report it to? So that's hopefully what we can, where we can go from here.
Well, sadly, I'm going to close. Just before I say thank you, I'd like to point out to everybody, I hope that the next time you're sitting in your risk meeting, you're looking very clearly at green crime as a risk, both from a legal standpoint, but also as a reputational risk, and something that you pick up and put on your agenda and figure out how you can help Che and the team achieve a world with free of green crime. So I hope one of our webinars, it may be a distant future, but hopefully not too distant, is about the fall of green crime. Che, I'd like to thank you so much for being an eloquent spokesman for a movement that we all support. And we do hope to have you back, I'm sure, to chat about progress as it occurs. Thank you.
Thank you very much.